Sophie and Percival were out among the flowers. "So," she said, "the witch turned you into a dog. Did you go straight to Mrs. Fairfax's?" "Yes," said Percival. "I was looking for Lettie. They were both very kind to me, even though they'd never seen me before. Then Wizard Howl kept visiting to court Lettie. Lettie didn't want him, and she asked me to bite him to get rid of him, until Howl suddenly began asking her about you." "What?" said Sophie. "Yes, he said, 'I know someone called Sophie who looks a little like you.' And Lettie said, 'That's my sister,' without thinking. The day you came there, she was being nice to Howl so as to find out how he knew you. Howl said you were an old woman, and Mrs. Fairfax said she'd seen you. Lettie cried and cried. She was so upset that I managed to turn into a man long enough to say I'd go and keep an eye on you." Sophie marched straight towards the castle, which had somehow turned into a mansion. She threw the door open with a crash. Howl and Michael were at the bench, hastily dismantling a spell. Part of it must have been to magic up the mansion, but the rest, as Sophie well knew, had to be a listening-in spell of some kind. As Sophie stormed in, both their faces shot nervously round towards her. Calcifer instantly plunged down under his logs. "Eavesdropper!" shouted Sophie. "Snooper! How long have you known I am under a spell?" said Howl. "Don't you think I know my own business well enough to spot a strong spell like that when I see it? I had several goes at taking it off you when you weren't looking, but nothing seemed to work. I came to the conclusion that you liked being in disguise." "Disguise?" yelled Sophie. Howl laughed at her. "Oh, it must be, since you're doing it yourself." He turned to Percival. "Do you know what the witch was trying to find out?" She wanted to know about Wales," said Percival. "I thought that was it." He turned to Michael. "I may be back quite late. It's going to be Midsummer Day after midnight, and the witch may well try something. So keep all the defences up, and remember all I told you, please." At about the same moment as Midsummer Day dawned, Howl crashed in through the door, fell over the chair and caught his foot in the stool so that it shot across the room. After that he tried to go upstairs through the broom cupboard. Finally he discovered the stairs, all except the bottom one, and fell up them on his face. Sophie stuck her head through the banister. "What's the matter?" "Rugby club reunion," said Howl. "Go to bed," said Calcifer. "You're drunk." "Who, me?" said Howl. "I assure you, my friends, I am cone-souled stubber." He got up and stalked upstairs, feeling for the wall as if it might escape him. The noise woke Michael and Percival, who came downstairs saying that they were so thoroughly awake that they might as well go out and gather the flowers for the midsummer garlands. Sophie, who decided to leave the castle for good, wasn't sorry to go out into the place of flowers for one last time. "He made it much better," remarked Percival, as he gathered an armful of hibiscus. "Who did?" said Michael. "Howl," said Percival. "They were only bushes at first." Michael was excited. "You remember being here before?" Percival was doubtful. I think I was here with the witch." They fetched in loads of flowers. There were the midsummer garlands to make. That took so long that before they'd finished, they had to open the shop and deal with a tremendous rush of customers. So many people came into the shop that it was getting on for midday before Sophie finally stole away through the broom cupboard and began packing up some food and her old clothes. She'd just picked up her stick when somebody knocked at the door. Sophie turned the knob down and opened it. A very large footman stood on the doorstep. Behind him in the drive was a carriage and a goodish pair of horses. "Mrs. Sacheverell Smith to call upon the new occupants," he said. Sophie began saying, "We're not at home," but Mrs. Sacheverell Smith swept the footman aside and sailed past, folding her parasol. It was Fanny, looking wonderfully prosperous in cream silk. "There must be some mistake," she said, looking round. "This is the servants' quarters." "Well, we're not really quite moved in yet, madam," said Sophie. Fanny turned round and gaped. "Sophie! Oh, good gracious, child, what's happened to you? You look about 90. Have you been very ill?" And to Sophie's surprise, Fanny threw aside her hat, her parasol, and all of her grand manner, flung her arms round Sophie and wept. "Oh, I didn't know what had happened to you. I went to Martha and I sent to Lettie and neither of them knew. They changed places, silly girls, did you know? I've a reward out still, and here you are, working as a servant when you could be living in luxury up the hill with me and Mr. Smith. Tell me everything." Sophie led Fanny to a chair. "It's a long story." When she finished, Fanny couldn't wait to tell her about Mr. Sacheverell Smith. She'd met him the very week Sophie had left and married him before the week was out. And then, with you not being there to pass it on to, there seemed no reason not to sell the shop. There was a clatter of feet in the broom cupboard and Michael came through. "We've shut the shop, and look who's here." He was holding Martha's hand. But when Martha caught sight of Sophie, she rushed at her and hugged her. "Sophie, you should have told me." This wasn't all. Lettie and Mrs. Fairfax came through the cupboard after Martha, carrying a hamper between them, and after them came Percival. "Bless me," said Mrs. Fairfax, "it's Fanny." She dropped her end of the hamper and ran to hug Fanny. Lettie dropped her end and ran to hug Sophie. In fact, there was such general hugging and exclaiming and shouting that Sophie thought it was a marvel Howl didn't wake up. But she could hear him snoring. Everyone was milling about, eating chicken and sipping wine, when Miss Angorian put her head round the door. "Oh, do excuse me. I've come at a bad time, haven't I? I just wanted to talk to Howl." Michael greeted Miss Angorian with a beaming smile. "Howl's asleep at the moment. Come and have a glass of wine while you wait." Sophie, ashamed of how she'd driven Miss Angorian out before, went over to her. "I'll go and wake Howl up." "Oh, no, you mustn't do that," said Miss Angorian. "I'm quite happy to wait. I thought I'd go and explore outside." Sophie opened the door for her. Somehow, maybe it had to do with the defences Howl had asked Michael to keep up, the knob had got turned round to purple down. Outside was a misty blaze of sun and drifting banks of red and purple flowers. Miss Angorian ran out. "What gorgeous rhododendrons! I must look." Sophie called after her, "Don't go towards the southeast." Suddenly Calcifer surged up from his logs, filling the chimney with blue flame. "Howl! Howl, Jenkins! The witch has found your sister's family!" Howl's bedroom door crashed open, and Howl came tearing downstairs. "Got me on my weak flank, blast her!" he shouted. He shoved Fanny aside, flung open the door, and hurled himself through it.